Welcome to this IVCO 2021 panel session. Before our speakers begin, we'd like to remind you of a few housekeeping rules. IVCO 2021 will have 17 sessions in total. This is one of them. In the first part of the session, you will hear the pre-recorded speeches from the moderator and all our speakers. Following this, we will have a live Q&A session with all the speakers present. So please stay with us until the end. If you have any questions for the speakers, please share them in the Q&A box. The moderator will ensure that your question is addressed by the respective speaker during the live part of the session. You can also click on the Share Audio and Video button. By doing so, you will appear on camera, giving you the opportunity to ask your question live in real time and get a direct and immediate response from our panel. We encourage you to do this as it will make the conversation more interactive and engaging for both you and the panel members. If you experience any technical difficulties, have questions about the format of the event, or need any further assistance, please use the chat box instead of the Q&A box, as we would like to keep this for raising questions to the panel. Please also remember that a full version of the session will be recorded and will be available for you to access from tomorrow onwards from the stage area. Thank you so much for joining. We hope you enjoy this session.
So, dear participants in this session, dear panelists, welcome to session 7, entitled Directionality, Emerging Volunteering for Development Modalities. So I'm Helge Espe from the Norwegian Agency for Exchange Cooperation, or NOREC for short, and I shall have the pleasure to moderate today's session, which will feature both contributions from a number of distinguished panelists, as well as be open to comments and questions and interventions from the floor afterwards. We thank Forum and ActionAid Greece for the opportunity to focus on some of the key issues in today's volunteering and personnel exchange world. By now, we have been living through more than 1.5 years of COVID-19. This pandemic has affected the lives, as we know, of millions of people. This was documented, for example, in the high-level political forum last July. We heard stories from around the world about decreased national income, even recession in many states, increased unemployment, especially among youth, decreased family income, reduced living standards, and failing social security networks. And as has been discussed many times, the implementation of the Agenda 2030 has fallen back maybe with several years. But at the same time, we have seen that the pandemic has, perhaps by necessity, unleashed innovation and ability to adapt and change. On individual level, we have seen that volunteers have been in the first line of response to the pandemic. Volunteers have been critical for the successful implementation of COVID testing and vaccine delivery programs. Volunteers have also taken care of vulnerable sick people and people in quarantine at an unprecedented scale. On organizational level, we have seen new program approaches, new strategies being put in place, almost by necessity. And we see redefinitions of organizational roles and tasks, and we see agencies scaling up and down according to new budget realities. In this situation, the traditional volunteering model has been challenged, that the global North donor countries send their country men and women to the global South to teach. There's still an important flow in international volunteering like that, but it has been quite extensively modified today. Even north-based volunteering agencies recruit a growing number of well-educated volunteers in the global south, and they go to other countries in the south. A few agencies also facilitate south to north volunteering. The global south, with its new middle-income countries and the emerging economies, are donors in their own right and bringing to the table their own skills and knowledge, and in many cases also their own finance. So the picture today is more multidirectional and more multipolar. The volunteering world, which is emerging, is then one of horizontality and reciprocity. On top of these directionality issues, the pandemic has also accelerated online volunteering and national volunteering in place of the usual international volunteering. The national measures put in place around the world to combat COVID-19, the closing of borders, which reduced opportunity to travel, caused a sharp decline in international volunteering and in personnel exchange. Consequently, virtual meetings and conferences for cooperation and sharing of knowledge have had a tremendous breakthrough. And that has also forced agencies to focus more on national volunteering opportunities and models. So both online and national volunteering are responses in which agencies are trying to avoid the need for international travel. But these responses have also brought new benefits and new advantages in their own right. And it can therefore be argued that many of these changes are here to stay. Actually, I think few today would believe that the world will return to what it was. We are experiencing an era of paradigm shift where agencies have to change and are looking for ideas and inspirations, as well as good practices. So in today's session, we shall look more in depth at these different modalities of volunteering, hopefully also bringing some fresh ideas to the table. We will explore in today's session how to build a diverse volunteering ecosystem. What are the strategies to enhance South-North, South-South, and reciprocal forms of international volunteering? How can we work towards more reciprocal relationship with partners? And we will have examples of this presented to us. We shall also explore which challenges organizations face in implementing such programs and how to overcome them. We shall also look at which policy reforms are needed to strengthen and build reciprocal relationship across the different modalities. And to set us off on these questions, we have today a diverse panel with a vast experience from different aspects of volunteering. They will tell us about how organizations have adapted to the new volunteering realities, and they will provide us with innovative models and good practices. So to save as much time as possible for participation and discussion later, I shall only mention them by name. You can read about their background and achievements under the speakers tab of the conference website, if you go there. So to save as much time as possible for participation and discussion after the presentations, I shall only mention the presenters by their names. You can read about their backgrounds, their achievements under the speakers tab of the conference website. So our presenters are Ujjwal Sundas from Samata Foundation, Nepal, Nadira Pervin from Nagorik Udyog in Bangladesh. We have Helen Perrell from Helen Perrell and Associates, South Africa. We have Alok Rath from Volunteer Service Overseas, UK. We have Matt Bailey Smith from Northumbria University, UK. And we have Thierry Debris from France Volontaire. So let us go to the presentations, and we will start with Ujjwal and Nadira. You have the floor. Thank you.
I thank IVCO for facilitating this session. We are very glad to be able to participate and share our experience. We will be talking about the creation of a strong partnership based on our experience working together. The partnership of this project is made up of by Samatha Foundation in Nepal and Nagarik Udyog in Bangladesh. The project is supported by Norwegian Agency for Exchange Corporation, known as NOREC. My name is Ujjwal Sundas, and I represent Samatha Foundation. In this presentation, you will be also hearing from Nadira Parvin, who is representing partner from Nagarik Udyog. So about the project, based on our overlapping field of work, our two organizations have created a project together. The basic purpose of this project is to promote the human rights of Dalits and marginalized communities collectively in Nepal and Bangladesh. There are several civil society organizations which are working with the topic in their own country specific context. We see that there are myriads of opportunities for learning and sharing among these organizations. This is why our two organizations have come together to share experiences and focus on mutual learning. When we talk about the feasibility study, this is mandatory in NOREC funded project, like in our project. This is the exploration phase, which lays the foundation for the partnership and the project. During the feasibility study, members from potential partner organizations visit one another's country and the organizations to get to know each other better and to work on the project plan. In our experience, the feasibility study has several benefits. The partner organization, the first one is the partner organization get to know each other better and build a strong relationship. This helps us to identify what we can teach each other and how our project can contribute to this. The second one is the visit of our members during the feasibility study helps to develop trust and commitment required for the partnership. This is an important foundation for future cooperation. And thirdly, the feasibility study also helps to learn about the living condition, the cultural aspects, and the society of the host country, which is quite important for planning the exchange of the fellows. Practical preparation. In this, in addition to increasing the knowledge and the understanding of each other, the feasibility study phase gave us the opportunity to learn about the practical aspect of the project. What were the financial guidelines? What were the criteria NOREC required for the volunteers? What were the guidelines for the result framework we had to develop, etc.? This was done both in partner meetings in our two organizations and also in a seminar with NOREC. This part of preparation made it easier for us to focus on what we wanted to achieve and not spend so much time trying to understand just the rules of the application. This means that we could focus more on the most important part, creating a reciprocal project. Now my colleague Nadira Parvin from Bangladesh will continue the rest of the presentation. Over to you, Nadira.
Thank you, Ujjwalji. As Ujjwalji mentioned, reciprocity as key element of our project. One that is mutual learning. In our project, reciprocity is very important. This means that we focus on mutual learning. We are learning from each other through sharing our work experience and expertise. For example, we must say Samatha Foundation from Nepal and Nagarik Udyog from Bangladesh, we are having partnership, and both the organization, we are working for promoting and protecting Dalit human rights. And we are sharing our learning and experience. We are also learning what Dalit women's situation in Bangladesh and how Dalit women's situation in Nepal. So we have experience and we are learning from each other through experience and expertise. And also we have strengthening our solidarity. How? Because of our throughout the feasibility phase, we know each other. So between two organizations, our solidarity is getting stronger day by day. And we had many discussions to build the project in our own way and with the support from absolutely NORAD. And however, the decision and discussion we made through our partnership, that also drive the project forward. And that is how a comfort between our both organizations, we have a understanding and also very comfortable zone is developed between two organizations. So we are exploring other opportunities to work further in future days on other opportunities also. So that means the foundation we have made can lead more opportunities for the both organizations. Next slide. Yeah. What does this mean for us? Many meeting points at different levels of the project cycle. We have many chances to meet each other, discuss, and different stages of project formulation. And that the fact that is such a vital part of the preparation phase, that means we are getting used to frequent meeting and communication. And you know, during the pandemic, this discussion has been very digital, and we have improved our way to cooperation through digital manner on the Zoom platform. And that has been easier to share our knowledge, because since we know each other very well from the project formation phase, now our project is going on and halfway we have done, it has been easier for us to share our research work and our working experience on the project related issue and also challenges. This way, we have made, both organizations have made better working environment with the relating to Dalit works, human rights issue, and also we are advocating. For example, we are campaigning for the Anti-Discriminatory Act, and Nepal already have that act. So we are sharing each other how we can pursue our relevant stakeholder to enact that law. And also we have another concept. We are building the Dalit human rights defender as a change maker for their own campaign, so that they can lead the campaign. So we are also sharing that idea with the Samhota Foundation. And we are believing, and we strongly believe, this approach has made it easier for us to work with the issue at regional level and also within our country level. You know about the COVID-19 situation, that the pandemic changed a lot. So we moved to digital exchange of knowledge. But now we have developed the digital knowledge. So we are sharing our knowledge through digitally, and how it has been also effective for us. And the importance of knowing each other, this would not have been easy if we did not know each other, because we know each other. Before the NOREC project, we implemented a regional project that also related to Dalit human rights, and we had a partnership there. So that understanding, and so we know each other strength and weakness, and we work through this. We started again through this project, and that actually was important for us to implement this project effectively and successfully, easier way. And we have a stronger future. We think this process has made us prepare to build another stronger relationship when the pandemic become and also it is going on, but through the digital platform, our partnership going on smoothly, and we are becoming benefited from each other through sharing knowledge.
Thank you, Nadira. Now let me summarize it. Our organization, Samata Foundation and Nagarik Udyog, spent a time to lay a foundation before we started our project. We built trust and knowledge, and now are able to have a good reciprocal partnership. Our organizations know each other, and we send our volunteers to one another's country, and they will be better prepared to contribute to our goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our participants. The research I'm going to draw on is two studies. The first one, COVID-19 and Volunteering for Development, was undertaken for Forum in 2020. We did 3 reports focusing on organizations using different directional modalities, and we worked with 6 IVCOs doing both field work and a survey for quantitative data. The second study we undertook for IAVE this year, it's just been released, called Leadership for Volunteering, the COVID-19 Experience, which looked at the leadership question of volunteer organizations across the globe. Just a few words about directionality and volunteering for development. Typically, directionality refers to the geographic nature of volunteer engagement and the movement of people in different directions in the volunteer space, north-south, south-north, and south-south. But directionality also applies within specific geographic contexts, such as national volunteers assigned to different parts of a country, and Helgi mentioned that, community volunteers assigned into neighboring countries or different social spaces in their own communities. And then finally, we see migration to the global north, producing opportunities for regional volunteering for humanitarian support and racial and gender justice. Now, the COVID impact on the practice of directionality is that, as Helgi mentioned, it challenged traditional models of directionality in international volunteering in particular, and it brought into focus the value of horizontal volunteering in the global south. But this could also apply in the global north as it emerges. The pandemic produced supply and demand side constraints in international volunteering. And for example, the supply side constraints took the form of travel being choked off, and volunteers in some cases, for example, in Japan, we found were put on standby to travel, but ultimately had to make difficult decisions because they had to survive and had to make other plans. So the organization, JICA, kept open the option for them to take up their placements once travel resumed. On the demand side, though, it also produced constraints since the organizations could not function as before, and so it limited the contributions that the volunteers could make, even using remote volunteering in the country and outside of it. Nevertheless, we saw that the South-South exchange programs proved to be robust despite the pandemic, and I think Norek's experience in this case is instructive. And then finally, the repatriation of international volunteers last year, when COVID was declared a pandemic, demonstrated the risk of sudden program closures in a health crisis, or possibly even in another crisis, where the northern citizens were called back by their governments. So the challenges for directionality is that there's been a debate that's developed in the field as to whether the remote volunteering will replace face-to-face volunteering. And just a few words on that. Although online volunteering is seen to facilitate access for homebound volunteers, it can also reproduce and exacerbate inequality in the context of the digital divide. Secondly, digital does not work everywhere, said one of our informants in the IAVE study. And in that study, Volunteer Canada reported that 56% of its members were able to adapt programming to virtual delivery, but 20 to 30% could not. Nevertheless, there is confidence among some of the participants, such as Noah and Jordan, who are feeling that everything needs to become a couple of clicks. But I think there was quite a strong feeling that the debate is, the options are not binary. And there is a real desire to continue face-to-face volunteering as best possible within the context of restrictions. And certainly that will come to the fore again as restrictions are lifted from time to time. But what this implies is there's a huge need for greater resource investment by IVCOs in host countries, because the IT infrastructure is simply missing in many, many cases, is deficient in other cases, and the cost is enormous for partner organizations, indigenous organizations, in host countries. And then we also just wanted to note in the challenges for directionality, the massive increase in informal volunteering in northern countries, which challenged formalized and vertical volunteer systems. Now, looking at the policy implications for directionality very briefly, as we know, COVID impacted on government measures to control their borders and the movement of people in and out of their countries. The current red list practices certainly prevent global South citizens from accessing countries in the global North, and this will compromise exchange programs. And as we've just heard from Nepal and Bangladesh, these bubbles which get created between areas in a particular region are able to facilitate exchange or movement of volunteers, certainly on what we're calling a South-South basis. But those travel bubbles would exist elsewhere. But the cross-border work certainly has some longevity and potential, growing potential in this context. And then finally, the costs of COVID-19 testing and the availability or lack of availability of vaccines will certainly constrain international cross-border travel and exchange, and has implications as well for inequality. Okay, and then on the resourcing implications for directionality, donors have seen over the last year how in-country volunteering is more sustainable in a pandemic than international volunteering. And because of the reduced risk of program closures, and our study for Forum demonstrates to a great extent the impact and importance of in-country volunteering in sustaining programs. But will this produce changes in funding approaches? And could it facilitate changes in directionality? Now, one of the issues in answering these two questions is the growing focus of policymakers and donors on inclusivity, and this may pose questions about power relationships and directionality, because, as I said at the beginning, directionality is generally assumed to refer to moving people from one place to another. But as we also know from the long history of North-South volunteering in the international space, directionality involves power imbalances. And that's particularly evident in the North-South relationships. In South-South relationships, there's a better power balance, but power nevertheless features in all directionality contexts. So this greater focus on in-country volunteering, national community-based, may produce different power balances in the future and in decisions made about directionality. And interestingly, the IAVE study showed that with COVID-19, volunteer leadership organizations placed much greater emphasis on mobilizing volunteers from within their own communities. And this is a feature of the impact of COVID. And 51% of our survey respondents agreed or strongly agreed that donors and policymakers have focused on enhancing inclusivity in volunteering because of COVID. And that's certainly a space to watch. And thank you so much for listening to me. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And there are some links if you want to access our research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, fellow participants. IVCO is always great, and I think Matt and I are very happy to be here along with other distinguished panelists, talking through the research that we are doing together, and there are some really interesting findings which does contribute to how we see the directionality of volunteering for development going forward. So we will start by just looking at as to the research that we are currently carrying out is called blended volunteering, and which is essentially trying to understand the combination of different volunteering modalities when they work together, and what do they lead to, and what are they telling us about how future development could happen, and how the blended volunteering or the volunteering combinations can be applied much more effectively, not just amongst the organizations that are applying or using volunteering as a methodology, but indeed in the wider development sector that is right now grappling with making advances on the SDGs. Matt and I will share about 7 slides that we have. I'll try and focus on the first couple of one, and indeed the one right in front of your screen, and then Matt will take over for next 3-4 slides. So when we're looking at research, and for VSO, research in volunteering for development is now critical as a reflective practice. So in the past 4-5 years, we have adopted very intentionally looking at our programming in the back of the the support of evidence about how volunteering works in our programs. So reflecting and then practicing. So that's the approach, and that does then put research in and around volunteering quite clearly at the center of our evidence-based programming and our thought leadership, in contributing to not only to VSO's program, but how they could also be, applicable to and useful to the wider, volunteer development sector. So intentionality of volunteer planning in project design is quite crucial. So VSO is no longer, I mean, that was perhaps how we saw ourselves, say, about a decade back, but no longer a volunteer sending or placement or volunteer programming organization. Volunteering quite clearly comes in the design of what it means to the development outcomes that one is trying to achieve, and therefore seeing where and what sort of volunteering is coming in to make sense. So therefore, there is what we call complementing skill sets, roles, the placement lens, and the nature, including, as Helen was talking around, remote volunteering, to all come together, and that makes sense depending on what is the development outcome that we're trying to achieve by applying a volunteer for development methodology. The other consideration, which I think is really crucial for us, is to look at primary actors are at the core of VSO programs. So if you look at VSO's People First strategy, it talks about primary actors. But for us, indeed, it is about critically reflecting as to how primary actors come in the entire project cycle or the program cycle. And that has increased our understanding and the emphasis around community volunteering and the role of community volunteering in that setup. So we'll hear a little more when Matt comes on that. And so therefore, the need and the desire for new knowledge around how, when different volunteering combinations come together from international to national to community, how do they work together? What does help them to work more effectively, and what could be the challenges around them that we must be mindful of and must address as we advance this practice of volunteering for development. This research has been funded by EPSIDIO, from the UK aid, and we believe that apart from contributing to VSO's own learning, it does contribute to the global practice on volunteering for development, which is why we're here to share about some of the preliminary outcomes of the research. I will now pass it to my colleague Matt. He will take us through the dimensions of the research. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Alok, and just add, from our end at kind of Northumbria University's end and my kind of team, it's great to be working with VSO, but it's also really good to be kind of connecting through IVCO as well. I mean, I think we attach a lot of importance to how we can make some of these connections. So thanks for the invitation. I'm just going to start by something that perhaps seems really, really obvious, but you'd be amazed in research that we don't actually do. And it's really important in the context of what Alok has said about changing modalities and changing ways of working. So when we were starting to work together, we need to ask that first question: what do we actually know about already? So what are the things we do have data and evidence on and understanding on? And what does the challenge of a kind of blended approach present for us in terms of research methods and questions? So you can see here, I'm not going to go through all of it, but a lot of the mainstream literature focuses on motivations, recruitment and experiences of individuals. It tends to focus on particular kind of directionalities to the exclusion of some others. There's quite a lot of measurement and kind of focus on efficiencies and a growing body of research on health volunteers. But what we don't know enough about yet is about community-led volunteering. We don't know about kinds of volunteering that don't fit the kind of modes and practices that we've all been obsessing about for the last 40 years, or many of us have been obsessing about. And we only have very preliminary understanding of relationships. So whilst we recognize the kind of relational dimensions of volunteering, what is slightly curious is if you read lots of the research, you would think that often volunteering takes place by a single volunteer and they go and complete their task. And we know that is not the case. And we know there is complexity and as Helena said and others, power relations, but actually the documentation and evidence and conceptualization of that is weak. So our research really set this challenge, working with VSO, of going, okay, This blended approach is present, but how does it work? Why does it work? What is going on? What are the key features? Now, I'm not going to talk through this in detail because the slides will be shareable and you can get in touch, but I think it's really important when we share research to be a bit open about how we did it. What kind of work was this? So you can see here these kind of main components, a lot of co-development work and kind of co-production work with VSO, both people like Alok and his team, Rebecca and others, but also within country offices. So to kind of co-design the work and a lot of conversations with stakeholders to make sure we were doing it the right way. Then there's a mix of kind of participatory approaches, kind of mapping approaches, interviews, workshops, as well as survey. And because of COVID, of course, it's been a mix of remote and face-to-face. And what I'm going to talk about, and Alex and I are discussing today, really comes from the first phase of field research in Tanzania. But there is ongoing work in Uganda and Nepal, which we'll be able to feed back on again soon. So I'm going to talk on this kind of first set of kind of findings. There's lots and lots of fabulous data that's coming out and fabulous stuff we'll be able to talk about in the coming period. And we're very open, as I'm sure VSO are, to kind of engage in the conversations about what the sense making is we're doing. But I want to flag one particular thing that's really been very strong, which echoes what some of the other contributors are saying, which is that in our data, community volunteers are perceived by everyone as contributing particular value to VSO's work. Now, before I say anything more about this, I think I want to give a kind of little note of caution, because you would think that in many of the debates, community volunteers are a new thing. When of course, actually, community volunteering has been the predominant form of voluntary labour globally for centuries. It just so happens that perhaps not enough attention has been paid to it. And we need to be very careful. And the second thing we need to be careful about is not to do what sometimes happens in the humanitarian and development sector, where we find another actor and then we give them a load of stuff to do, which doesn't challenge power relations and ignores the kind of complex ecosystems in place already. I want to give a couple of examples then about what we found out around kind of community volunteering and its role in the blend. So firstly, that a lot of stakeholders spoke about their translation, the ability to kind of, act at the interface between different kinds of volunteers and community needs. But one of the key things in that is to move beyond the usual word translation. That doesn't mean language, that means culture, that means norms. And the other thing that's been really interesting is this geography to how some of the languages work. So very often you get a geographical description of community volunteers because they're local. And you get a technical expertise description of volunteers when they're international. Whereas, of course, community volunteers have incredible expertise, skills, knowledge, and abilities. So these languages are a real issue. The second key finding for us was the way that community volunteers are critical to sustainability and legacy. And I think overall, what we're beginning to find is, if dealt with and spoken about and understood ethically and carefully, that actually the kind of blended approach that brings these things together in a programmatic way provides an opportunity to decenter the focus on international volunteers and to decenter the North-South story in how we understand volunteering in relation to development. And I'm going to hand that back now to Alok, I think, for the next slide.
Thank you, Matt. I think, so what is emerging right now is, as Matt has concluded, there are a number of leads that one has to take and be mindful of as we're working on the blended approach to volunteering. And I think the significance of the various modalities has already been spoken. So the research is again demonstrating that when we're looking at the perception of different status and all the levels of expertise of the varying modalities, it is the perception which is so key as to be aware of how each of the volunteering or volunteer typologies is seen and perceived. And this is particularly for VSO, this is so crucial in designing, in people planning, in really making sure that your organizational architecture, infrastructure, and the culture is all geared to manage the the blended volunteering combinations, because the perception could be playing quite a significant role. So when we look at that, the perceived difference, the research is obviously coming up with saying the perception is around the status, the benefits that volunteers seem to be getting, financial, non-financial, what one is seen as to be in her or his contract, how much am I getting, how much you're getting. All this do ultimately come together to play what we have seen as the dynamics of power. And understanding that and being aware of that actually are the areas that one has to not just know, but plan against, is going to help when you're looking at how the horizontal relationships are critical, when we're looking at the blended volunteering modalities working. So there is the factor around culture, and the factor around how that pans out in individual behaviors of volunteers, given the different backgrounds that they come from, and that sometimes also leads to interpersonal conflicts, and those conflicts are not necessarily leading to a destructive mode, but the conflicts which are obviously telling and bringing out and telling us to where these modalities could come together, be more effective when we are taking the the backgrounds, the perceptions, and the lived realities of volunteers when they're working together into consideration. So in conclusion, at this moment, and this is preliminary, is that blended volunteering is definitely seen as the direction to go, is the way forward, and that when we're using them appropriately, that leads to much greater, deeper impact and empowerment of primary actors, or the people on the ground in the communities. At the same time, very important to recognize that it also is telling that there is no one size fits all. So it is all about making sure that project designs take into account what is the context and who do you want to have in that context, and what therefore you need to be building in making that particular combination work. And as Matt presented, community volunteers are seen absolutely central to how primary actors, and I think I probably would want to say very briefly that in our work, our ultimate goal is to see that to building agency, empowerment, and capability of primary actors. And in that, the role of community volunteers is seen to be a critical link, and it's very important to build that in. I think what we're also learning is that as we understand the role and contribution of community volunteer and their place in the volunteering ecosystem, we're also clearly seeing the value of international volunteers, for instance, or national volunteers, for instance, and therefore you could really see that there is a strong complementarity which is possible only when you understand what's happening on the ground. Like as Matt was saying. So it is also about minimizing the risk of a power imbalance, which is dependent on addressing what I just spoke some time back about the perceived inequalities. And that is one thing that we are very clearly focused on addressing. When we are looking at agency empowerment and capability of primary actors, what we essentially are saying that we were addressing inequalities, structural inequalities that exist in the societies, in the communities, in the households. Now, if we don't really understand that in the volunteering ecosystem, then we might be missing an important link. And some of us who probably could relate to the relational volunteering model that came out of value volunteering research 5-7 years back, would also tend to agree that these inequalities, the inequalities at the community level, are squarely dependent on how volunteers work in that relational model. And finally, everyone who are a part of this particular research had a positive and leveraging experience of the blended nature of volunteering, so the working together, and therefore do positively see this as the way forward. And we believe, the evidence that we are expecting out of Uganda and Nepal are obviously going to corroborate, but perhaps also going to add more insights into our understanding of the blended volunteering model that we think is one of the directions forward. Thank you so much. Matt, is there anything else you wanted to add?
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Alok.
Thank you.
Hi, LGSP. Thierry Debris from France Volontaire. France Volontaire is a French platform of volunteering for international exchange and solidarities, with different offices all over the world. And the case studies is a pilot action for South-South cooperation in the field of migration and cross-mobility of Moroccan, Senegalese, Ivorian, and Malian volunteers involved in a French international voluntary scheme. Mainly driven by Western countries, international volunteering has long been on one-way street from these countries to third countries. The absence of nationality requirements in the recruitment of volunteers has created an opening for other forms of mobilities. The volunteer corps set up by international institutions has made it possible to initiate mobility within the African continent. UNV, ECOWAS Volunteer Programme, African Union Youth Volunteer Corps. However, this national mechanism and those of international organizations constitute of a mobility offer based on commitment and solidarity that too limited on the scale of the continent. Yet, in 2050, more than half of the African population will be under 25 years old, and more than a third of the world's youth will be African. The issue of voluntaries on a global scale will therefore be an African issue. Two elements have certainly contributed to the momentum around the structuring of voluntaries on the African continent. The African Youth Charter in 2006, the Decade for the Youth for Development in Africa 2000 and 2019. Since 2007, several states have set up national volunteer schemes, often with the support of various partners. United Nations Volunteers Programme, International Organization of the Francophonie, and France Volontaire. In Burkina Faso, Niger, Benin, Mali, Togo, Cameroon, Rwanda, Guinea. Over the past 2 years, several countries have defined the legal framework within which to develop voluntaries. Chad, 2019, Ivory Coast, 2019, Senegal, 2021, and Morocco, 2021. These schemes develop a national voluntarism that is sometimes not considered in its international dimension. In order to develop intra-African mobility around solidarity and commitment, the challenge is now to define national schemes that can interconnect, hosting volunteers from other countries visit its teams and sending volunteers who will be taken care of by the host country's team. It is within this framework that several experiments are being conducted, including the one by France Volontaire in partnership with Expertise France under the South-South Volunteer Pilot Action. This initiative is part of the South-South Cooperation Action on Migration with Emergency Trust Fund and BMZ. It aims to accompany Morocco, Senegal, Mali, and Ivory Coast in the implementation of reciprocal commitment in the field of migration on the basis of action plans established jointly by these countries. It should help promote the sharing of experiences and the transfer of practices for better South-South mobility. Launched in January 2020, the project has been strongly affected by the effects of the pandemic. Between January and March 2021, 16 volunteers were deployed. 8 Moroccans, 5 Senegalese, 2 Ivoirian, and 1 Malian. The Moroccan volunteers are deployed in the 3 sub-Saharan African countries. Senegalese, Ivoirians, and Malians are deployed in Morocco. The volunteers work with associations, local communities, public institutions, on one of the 2 axes of intervention of the South-South Cooperation Action. Migration and development, in particular under the aspect of policy and practices, of mobilization of diaspora at national, regional, and local level, access to migrants' rights under the aspect of integration and reintegration. The objective is to bring the public authorities in charge of volunteering in the 4 countries to pursue this form of mobility by defining adapted legislative and regulatory frameworks. As the 4 countries are at different levels in the design and implementation of national volunteering policies, volunteers are under the French statute of volunteer for international solidarity, which doesn't include nationality conditions. The only limitation is that one cannot commit oneself in one's own country, given that it's a matter of international solidarity. Volunteers are deployed with instructors identified by France Volontaire in collaboration with authority. The content of the mission has been defined. Volunteers are recruited according to the country, either by the instructors proposing candidates or by advertisement. Prior to their deployment, the volunteers followed a mission preparation module. A review of the experience is planned at the end of the mission. The duration of the mission are between 7 to 10 months. The main element characterizing the profile of the 16 volunteers recruited: 6 women, an average age to 29 years from 24 to 35. 3 have a doctorate, 11 has a master's degree, 1 or 2, 2 have a bachelor's degrees, 8 out of 16 have a degree and or professional experience directly related to migration issues. Master or doctoral student in migration rights, international relations, master in transnational migration, Master in Sociology of Migration. 11 out of 16 have a first professional experience of 1 to 5 years. 10 out of 16 have a first professional experience and or an associative commitment related to migration issues. 14 out of 16 have an associative commitment. In parallel to this development of volunteers, France Volontaire has carried out an inventory of existing South-South volunteer programs and initiatives. These inventories were presented to the authority of the countries concerned, and the webinar have held for the representative of the 4 countries. In the South-South volunteer pilot action, the volunteer is both an end and a means. Purpose because in the long run, the 4 countries concerned must define the conditions for continuing these cross exchanges. Means because it's allowed to reinforce the action of the structures and the migratory questions, and to develop partnership relations between the structures of the 4 countries. Thank you.
Welcome to everybody. We have a nice audience today, I think of 58 people, and I am very happy to welcome you all. We, both myself as a moderator and the panel, we would really like to engage in discussion with you, and now we are live. This is not any longer a recording, so we can be challenged the way we should be. My name is Helge Espe, and the panel has already been introduced, so we can go on. Now in the dialogue, if you wish to have the floor for a comment or question to the speakers, you should use the Q&A box and not the chat box. The chat box is for other kinds of communication you might have during the session. When you get the floor, you turn on your microphone and camera, introduce yourself, and you should be as short as possible, because we are really short on time. I should thank the speakers as well, my fellow speakers. You have presented a wide range of issues, from research and over to the practitioner's point of view, and you covered policy issues as well as practical implications. So to make sure that all of you get the feedback, I have thought it's best that we in a way go one by one, and we start with a follow-up question to each of you, and then the audience can follow up on that particular presentation. So we open up for that. So Helen, your presentation, you introduced for us concepts that sometimes we are not so familiar with in the volunteering world. Demand and supply constraints, vulnerability, risk management for organizations. Those are concepts from the business spheres and other parts of society. And I also think in particular what you introduced is that in the concept of directionality, you expand and say that in-country volunteering is also an aspect of that. And then again, you raise issues of power relation and inclusivity. And how do you see the future here? Do you think that now states, donors, and implementers, have they, during the COVID period and even in the years before, have they become more aware of the power aspects of relationship? And is it at all possible to design fair, equal, and reciprocal programs in the world that we have today and that we are going to have tomorrow? What would be your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Helgi. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks very much. It's a tough question. You know, it relates very closely to the debate on decolonization. And I think Ben and Victor have, their paper really helps us in looking at this issue. But, you know, it's both a directionality of power in the sense of between and within countries. And within countries, especially in the light of COVID-19, we see increasingly the shrinking of civil society space, which impacts directly on the volunteer movement. And so it's not simply a case of North-South or international volunteering. It is also very much an issue within countries. And then also, I just wanted to, you know, I think Ben and Victor's paper speaks a great deal about racialized and class power relationships. And that is both between countries, between hemispheres, and within countries, my own country being one prime example. And one can see a couple of examples of that, where it impacts, for example, those power relations impact on who has access to various kinds of infrastructure, including digital infrastructure, which is obviously, as we've discussed, a really big factor in the volunteering environment now. Standard setting is another example of power relationships. Whose standards, who participates, and Jacob Marty and I presented a paper to the IVCO 2019 in Rwanda, looking at that issue. And I have to echo also Matt's point about we just do not have enough research and knowledge about what this situation looks like. How does it play out within countries? And in Jacob and my paper, we did mention a very interesting example of a standard setting organization in Uganda called Geneva, but I won't go into that. I think the issue is, well, what do you do about it? And I had a word with Cliff, and I think, you know, also Ben and Victor have mentioned, you know, you've got to put these issues on the table. You've got to have a safe space in which to actually ventilate the issues from the different points of view. And as Alok mentioned, you know, there are a lot of tensions. One comes with a history, and this is not an easy task. And, you know, who will be brave enough to actually make themselves vulnerable within that conversation? And so there are a lot of factors at play, but it is an intrinsic part of decolonization, I think. So maybe just to raise two issues. The one is the issue of consciousness. Are we aware of the issues of power? Our own power, or as individuals, as organizations? And again, Ben and Victor made the point that one's got to actually start addressing power relations within one's own organization and within the partnerships. You know, that is an extensive process. But it's essential to actually translate into implementation and program design. And then just a last point, I think I did mention the issue of soft power. And this is something that it's a global phenomenon, and it demonstrates specific political and economic interests. And the volunteer movement internationally plays out within that agenda. So what are the options for volunteering for development actors? Large organizations, smaller ones? Can one find the partners the funding partners who will actually buy into a decolonization agenda? I mean, I'm raising more questions than answers, Helgi, and you might have some suggestions yourself.
Thank you, Helen. I think you are raising the key questions, but I would like to allow a comment from the floor also at this stage, if there is any. Sophia, with your kind help, is there anyone in the Q&A box who wants the floor?
We have one from Cliff. How do you see the issue of identity of community volunteers in relation to IVCOs as against primary actors? What are the consequences of IVCOs bringing them more explicitly into their programs?
Thank you. Would you like that one, Helen?
Maybe we should take all three and then I can just quickly respond.
Excellent.
From Susan, do any of you face Northern national funders who are refractory to funding national volunteering versus national volunteering? Sorry, my cursor is on the questions. And one more from Heather. Thank you. Question to Helene. Did you see any innovations for resourcing multi-directional volunteering modalities? These are the questions so far.
I think we should also pass on to you, Alok, and Matt. And you introduced the concept of blended volunteering, and you underline the importance of research. And the blending means really an interplay between international and national and community volunteers. But we know already that within the volunteering community, people would see each other differently. And for example, it's very common for when volunteers meet that one is there to teach and the other one is there to learn. And how can you overcome that in the melting pot of volunteers that you are talking about, bringing together all these 4 or 5 different types of volunteers and still maintaining the perspective of equality and fight against inequalities. Please.
Chindukuma, Matt, you happy for me to go first?
Yeah, you go first. That's great.
Right. Okay. So I think just thanks so much, Helge, for that question. I think, just building on from where Matt left in that particular point when he was making, as an example from the evidence, when we see that the when we look at the context in the community, and the community volunteer do make a difference in the area of language, it actually transcends, to a number of areas that define power. What is research also coming up is telling us that in the context of COVID, one was very pleasantly surprised as the research was, the preliminary findings are telling us that there are a number of areas in which traditionally or earlier, one would think that the community volunteers are not suitable for, or may not necessarily be able to contribute and lead the local development agenda. They were in number of cases they were able to do so. So I think what this research is trying to dig deep into and understand, unravel, unpack is the central question of demystifying or decoding power and understanding the interrelationships between the different volunteering modalities when they come together, how they could be effectively forging combinations. And as I had said earlier, this is critical when we think from the perspective of the primary actor or the people on the ground, and thinking from the lens of what their development agenda is. That then helps to tailor-make and adapt the volunteering typologies to really relate to and contribute to the development outcomes over there. there are, of course, we can always continue to talk about, but Matt may have a point to add at this moment. Yeah, Matt?
Thanks, Alok. I mean, try and draw 2 or 3 bits together about this. And I think the first thing, and Alok is exactly right, a lot of this is not, there are histories, long histories of inequality and unequal power relations. So no matter how good some programming design is, it cannot eradicate those histories of inequality. And we need to be really honest about that in trying to start to do things differently, there are long legacies over different scales and over times of how people have experienced some of these different actors. And we can't write that out in a moment. So I think that's my first thing is, let's be really careful not to go into the language of what is the technical fix to get everyone to get on together, because that's not a space we can be in. And I think there's a link here to Cliff's question. I know we're running out of time, so I think Cliff's question is really, really important. I think it's important to kind of try and bring it in. And Cliff's question is about how we see the identity of community volunteers. And if we think of this conversation we're having about, these unequal relations and so on, that many of this group that we've just imagined in our heads as community volunteers don't see themselves as community volunteers. They don't use the language of volunteering. The language of volunteering comes from a particular place and does particular work in particular places. So before we even start, we need to start being honest about whose language is naming what's going on. Development and humanitarian work has a long history of naming particular categories in ways that are rather more suitable to external actors. So we need to be very careful about the languages that they use. I would suggest that, and I'm lucky, I'm a researcher, I'm a professor, I don't have to get into some of this, but actually I would suggest that a starting point which really crosses over research and practice, which I suppose is what I'm actually interested, is some of these conversations at community level about how some of these languages are starting to land in this sudden rush to recognition of community volunteering and understanding these relationships. Who is part of the conversation? Who is being brought into that conversation about what is now going to happen next, in line with the soft power that Hélène has spoken about? So to me, that all links together. We need to be really serious about the power relations that are at play and who is in the room to shape what happens next. So that will be my comment.
Thank you very much. What should we say now, since we are very, very short of time? Should we say that the questions which have come up could go to all of you who are online? It seems regrettably that Sophia and Ujjwal are not online, but if they should be able to get online, I will definitely give them the floor for a comment. But Hélène, you got some questions after your presentation. Have you given those issues a closer thought at this time?
Yes, thank you, Helgi. I have, and I'm picking up on something that Matt just spoke about, which is about naming and this sense about community volunteers being a bunch of individuals. And I think that really, that is a complete misnomer, because the levels of organization within a country and within communities are very sophisticated and go over many, many decades, centuries, and so on, around mutual aid and other forms of support. So there are community-based organizations, there are associations, there are many, many different structures that one needs to take into account and engage with. And then part of the question, I think, was about community volunteers in relation to primary actors. Well, community volunteers, by definition, are working within a community-based context, but they are not only within their own, they move in different parts depending on the program that they're working with. My understanding, and I could be wrong here, my understanding of primary actors is that they are very often NGOs who are, sorry, it's my watch going, NGOs that are funded by international or other donors or foundations, and some of our research in VOCISA, our 5-country study, demonstrated how those NGOs acting in the volunteer space can sometimes act detrimentally in relation to community-based organizations, creating dependencies and so on. Then on the Northern funders funding national volunteering, yes, we did. There were definitely instances, volunteer service overseas being one of them. But in fact, the resourcing of multi-directional volunteering is quite well developed. Most NOREC leads by example. In Peru, we found QSO reintroducing its funding of South-South volunteering. And there were these excellent examples from Thierry. What a fascinating study and pilot project, and I'm really looking forward to that. So I just want to mention that in our IVCO research, the volunteer leadership organizations, a number of them, out of the COVID experience, have been calling strongly for the establishment of national volunteer schemes. And we've had national youth organizations all over the continent in Africa in the past and still do. But the national volunteer schemes, I think, are a very interesting development, certainly within the African region and the other regions that we worked on for the ERA study. I hope that answers some of the questions or provides a perspective.
Thank you very much. The time is almost up. I can only apologize for the technical hiccups we have had today with our Sophia Nujral and not even Thierry coming online. To me, it shows that we need to meet in person again and do not face these hiccups. And I think I really look forward to the day that we can go to the corner and discuss these things without the constraints of that we are facing in that now. I think a common denominator in what you all have been talking about in your presentations and later, it is the issue of power. And I am very pleased personally to see that one doesn't only talk about inclusion as a sort of a passive element, but we talk about inclusion in relationship to power, because it is power which is the basis for whether you are in and not, and even inclusion as a concept means that the one who are able to include or not is the one also exercising power. I'm very happy for the theme of this conference, taking this up to me in a much stronger and more systematic way in the volunteering world that I have seen before. I think the framing paper and the sessions and also the short papers being delivered are much more geared to the issues of power that I really feel are important to address between partners, but also the aspects that were mentioned, like soft power, and also the aspect that I feel was raised by Thierry, and unfortunately he couldn't come in, but I think his presentation also in a way raises the question of inclusion of non-academics in the volunteering world, and how we can get people of all classes and social statuses into volunteering, and not only academic people. So there are many questions left to be discussed, and we look forward to the next time we can meet virtually or physically to do that. So with that, I think I only can close the session from my point of view. Thank you to all. Thank you to the presenters and the panel, and not at least to the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helge. Thank you, everyone. Bye.